Okay. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's roundtable discussion hosted by the Environment and Social Issues Cluster under the Center for New Economic Studies. I am Tanishi, along with my colleague Prabhu, and together we'll be guiding today's conversation on a topic that is crucial to our future and our planet: carbon pricing. As the global community continues to wrestle with escalating crisis of climate change, finding effective strategies to reduce greenhouse emissions has never been more urgent. Among these strategies, carbon pricing has emerged as a vital tool. By putting a financial cost on carbon emissions, we're not just creating a fiscal framework, we're pushing industries, governments, and individuals to rethink their actions and move towards a more sustainable future. But like any significant policy shift, there are complexities, challenges, and opportunities. Today, we'll explore the various facets of carbon pricing, the mechanisms that are being adopted, how businesses are navigating these changes, and the evolving role of voluntary carbon markets. We've brought together a brilliant set of columnists today, each ready to share their unique insights and experiences. By the end of this session, we hope to shed light on not just how carbon pricing works, but why it holds so much potential in the global fight against climate change. So, without further ado, let's get started. So, Aditi, carbon pricing mechanisms comes in many shapes and forms. As governments and organizations seek solutions to tackle emissions, understanding the variety of tools available is essential. Could you walk us through some of the important key mechanisms that are available and how they differ in terms of structure and impact?
So starting with an introduction on carbon trading. Carbon trading, also known as emissions trading, is as set out in Article 17 of the Kyoto Protocol, is a market-based system. It allows for the buying and selling of carbon credits by creating a market, as it creates a new commodity in itself. It is incentivizing action and innovation in sustainability. It holds the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and utilizes economic models of taxing and trading schemes to encourage reductions in GHG emissions as its critical strategy. Parties under the Kyoto Protocol, particularly the Annexure B parties, have accepted targets for reducing emissions expressed in levels divided into assigned amount units, AAUs, removal units, the RMU, emission reduction units, ERU, and certified emission reduction, CER. It is imperative to combat the continued dependence on fossil fuels for growth and development by bringing attention to the equitable use of common goods such as the global atmosphere and natural resources. To make net zero emissions possible, certain mechanisms in place allow for accounting of the emission impact of enterprises, business, individuals, and government on local, national, and international scales. Carbon trading bridges a gap between private benefit and exploitation of natural resources, or rather, the maximum utilization of natural resources. To meet nationally determined contributions, the NDCs, in their action plans, emission reduction targets as pledged. There are several mechanisms in place and they are utilized, but still they face issues such as carbon leakage, information tracking, evaluation, and the inability to guarantee reduction or control emissions, which have sustained. So, carbon tax is a direct tax on each unit of carbon dioxide content of fossil fuels. The cap and trade, also known as emissions trading method, sets the limit, a cap on total emissions, and allows for trading of allowances and permits. They are allocated and auctioned by the government, providing clear targets while allowing flexibility. Hybrid systems combine the elements of the first two to balance price certainty with emission reduction incentives in policy objectives. New emissions trading systems are increasingly hybrid, moving beyond traditional cap and trade systems such as China and Canada, which have implemented intensity based systems where emissions are measured relative to output. Moreover, Indonesia too has a cap tax and trade system that basically mixes different carbon pricing tools. Then the offset mechanism, which sets a baseline level for emitters who can earn credits and tradable certificates when emissions are below this baseline. However, verification is still difficult. There are issues of double counting, and rigorous standards must be implemented for success. Projects and programs that successfully achieve their climate reductions come under the result based climate finance. Moreover, to combat the imported carbon through traded commodities, a burden carbon adjustment is imposed, such as carbon tariffs on imports from countries with weaker or no carbon pricing policies. Then, internal carbon pricing is when organizations establish a virtual or internal carbon price reflecting the cost of emitting 1 unit of carbon dioxide, which is factored into their budgeting, investment decisions, and operational planning. In Japan and India, for example, voluntary ETSs are being used as initial steps toward developing compliance based systems to encourage and incentivize organizations to reduce their carbon footprint. The EU emission trading system was the first carbon market established back in 2006, and it's still the largest in operation today. The EU's Fit for 55 reforms in 2023 further introduced major changes, including a steeper reduction rate for emissions, the inclusion of maritime transport, and the creation of a new EU ETS 2 for sectors like building and road transport. Currently, there are 36 ETSs operational worldwide, covering 18% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and an additional 22 systems are in various stages of development or consideration. Jurisdictions with an ETS in place currently represent a good 58% of global GDP, while about representing one third of the global population. So, in reality, comprising mostly of developed or fast developing nations. India's carbon credit trading scheme is a work in progress national carbon credit electronic platform with a carbon market framework to support entities that are undertaking projects to decarbonize the Indian economy and develop a combining compliance ETS with voluntary credit systems. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aditi. That was a great breakdown of mechanisms and how they fit into the broader climate strategies. The nuances and implementation make a world of difference, as you can see. Now, businesses are not only affected by carbon pricing, they also play a crucial role in how mechanisms are implemented. Could I now invite Shaurya to share your thoughts on how carbon pricing influences businesses, perhaps with a case study that shows real world implications?
Right. So when I speak on this subject, I will give a very simple economic breakdown. For example, carbon pricing in any of its form, whether you talk about carbon tax, which is directly taxing the polluter for each unit of emission, where you imply a business cost towards that, that increases any polluters and any industries production cost of whatever they are producing. So initially, we were giving examples of EU's reforms, where they initially targeted like producers of steel and aluminum. So their production cost went higher, which forced the companies to do a certain amount of things. That is, firstly, invest in low carbon and renewable technologies to minimize their risk and make more sustainable profits, firstly. Secondly, another change that this caused in investment is because after this global shift in narrative towards renewable technology and renewable investment, people who are working in sectors that are more energy intensive need to be very vigilant and tight with their systems in order to minimize carbon leakages in any form, because of which the EU carbon adjustment border mechanism was also introduced. So these are some of the key things that have happened because of it. One more thing that, as my colleague rightly mentioned, that companies are doing is internal pricing mechanisms, such as shadow pricing, which actually is a very good option because it leads to an internal awareness of the pollutionary damage that the company's practices can be causing to the environment, firstly, and leading to better pricing options and better changes. One case study or one example that I would like to give here is that of Microsoft. Microsoft started its own Microsoft Sustainability Manager program, where it started to calculate and anticipate carbon pricing mechanisms and make accommodating changes for it. since 2012, which has led to Microsoft recently announcing its climate commitment, where it's saying that Microsoft will go carbon negative by 2030. When, and again, just to simplify what carbon negative means, going carbon negative basically means when a company is removing more carbon dioxide than it's actually emitting. By 2050, Microsoft actually aims to remove all the emissions it has done ever since its inception in 1975. So I think Microsoft, in that manner, is actually leading the reform in that sense and setting up a very good example for other such MNCs worldwide. So I think internal price mechanisms can actually help companies predict carbon mechanisms, adjust their costing structures in a manner and profit in that way, stay in the business and stay in the market in the long term, secondly. And thirdly, given the example of Microsoft, this also helps them set apart from the competition. So it actually adds another level of incentivization for them to stay in the market for a longer period, dominate in different terms. Not to deviate much from the topic, but I'm pretty sure we all have witnessed a recent social trend that is criticizing major MNCs and business corporations who are not very sustainable in their practices and whose practices are leading to a lot of environmental degradation and damage. That has not only caused technical and typical corporations and businesses to adjust to carbon prices, but even more mixed forms of creative entrepreneurship, such as concerts, to reevaluate their own systems. Now, I can produce another example here if that isn't deviating too much from the topic about creative setups. If I should, so again, so right now, Coldplay are very much in the news for setting up their concerts in India for after too much time, and all the tickets are going wild. And so one of the things that is again making Coldplay again very relevant and very popular is their sustainable mechanism. So Coldplay is actually one of the most sustainable performance bands out there because they use kinetic floor energies so that whenever people are dancing in the concerts or they're enjoying themselves, they use that to produce electricity firstly for their shows. All their electricity and other power mechanisms are charged by renewable setups. And thirdly, they claim that they're planting a tree for each and every ticket sold, especially in the Europe tour. So that's again a lot of sustainable plans made, and they have released a sustainability report saying that they have reduced their carbon emissions by 45% in comparison to their previous tour. Now, while all this sounds very well and good, I would just like to use this to bring one more important factor up. That even though there are a lot of reports claiming these positive changes, one more thing that companies are very notorious in doing is greenwashing. So a lot of problems with a lot of mechanisms, especially the climate financing mechanisms, where you have to pay a lot of money upfront for the company to make certain innovative changes to the way it's managing its projects in order to, at the end, result in lower emission rates. Is that a lot of times companies make misleading claims that cannot be completely technically verified and lead to further greenwashing because they are presenting that they are green while they are not green. So there are certain things that still need to be inspected more into to develop more technical monitoring frameworks. But based on certain examples of brands such as Coldplay and companies such as Microsoft, there is hope that we can incorporate these frameworks better in an international setup.
That was quite insightful, Shaurya. It's interesting to see how businesses are adapting and sometimes innovating under carbon pricing pressures. The balance between compliance and competitiveness in this case really stands out. So moving on, voluntary carbon markets have become a buzzword lately. They're seen as a flexible tool for companies and countries to engage in climate action. But there's still some ambiguity around their effectiveness. Keeping this in mind, may I now invite Devyansh to clarify what exactly are voluntary carbon markets and how they contribute to driving climate action?
Right. Thank you, Tanishi. Getting into it straight away. So, as you said, voluntary carbon markets is a term that has gained significant traction in recent years, especially with the rise in the usage of the word carbon finance as well. So voluntary carbon markets, basically they offer a market-based mechanism which is supposed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and this operates on the buying and selling of carbon credits. carbon credits are a sort of currency that represents 1 ton of carbon dioxide being equivalent to 1 carbon credit. So basically, 1 carbon credit translates to 1 ton of carbon dioxide being avoided or removed from the atmosphere. Now, it's also worth noting that these carbon credits aren't issued arbitrarily. The process is governed by very set prescribed standards, which are set by recognized and mostly non-profit institutions. And this ensures that the credits are legitimate and they actually represent real environmental benefits. Without these standards, the market would lack the transparency and the accountability that it needs to function effectively. But then, what exactly makes the voluntary carbon market different from other regulatory tools, such as internal pricing mechanisms or even Coldplay's tree planting spree, like Shaurya spoke about? So the key lies in the word voluntary. Unlike mandatory compliance markets, where companies are required to meet specific emission reduction targets by law, VCMs or voluntary carbon markets are entirely optional. Companies participate not because they have to, but because they want to. This participation is driven by growing expectations from stakeholders, customers, the board of directors, and all of them expect companies to be more environmentally aware and proactive in reducing their emissions. So, how does this work in practice? Let's take a simple example. Imagine a farmer somewhere in the world plants a tree that reduces 1 ton of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. This farmer can then approach a project developer or an assessor to verify how much carbon the tree is removing. After a formal assessment, an independent body validates this and this issues the farmer a carbon credit. The farmer can then sell this credit to a company, let's say a steel company, for example. This steel company can now use this credit to offset 1 ton of their emissions without further harming the atmosphere because that 1 ton has actually been accounted for elsewhere, and in this case, by the farmer's planted tree. To put this into perspective, removing just 1 ton of carbon emissions requires the planting of 50 trees for an entire year. It's a significant investment in time and resources. And to see how far VCMs have come, even in our very own country of India, by May 2023, an impressive 163 million carbon credits had already been purchased. This staggering number highlights just how effective VCMs have been in the global effort to minimize emissions. Now, then again, why would companies choose to voluntarily participate? Simple, because even in the most well-intentioned companies, they often find themselves engaged in activities that result in unavoidable carbon emissions. This is where VCMs come into play. When companies cannot reduce their emissions internally, they can compensate for this by financing projects known as carbon projects that avoid or remove emissions elsewhere. These projects range from reforestation efforts to renewable energy initiatives. And the key incentive for companies, as I said before, is the PR boost because they are perceived as being environmentally responsible and sustainable. For many companies, this is part of the strategy to be perceived as non-destructive and forward-thinking. Some companies are even going a step further, using natural methods to minimize emissions, such as enhancing soil absorption of carbon or harvesting rainwater to promote healthier trees. Other companies are exploring artificial methods like direct air capture technology to actively remove carbon from the atmosphere. These are all innovative ways in which companies can gain or sell carbon credits to meet their emission reduction goals. What's even more interesting is that voluntary carbon markets aren't just for massive MNCs. They can also start at very elementary levels, such as community-based projects. While obviously community-based projects do add much smaller value as compared to an MNC, they do add a valuable dimension to the overall goal of minimizing emissions. They empower communities to contribute to climate action, and this makes VCMs a very versatile tool for both big as well as small players. Thank you.
Thank you, Devyansh, for the comprehensive explanation. It is evident that while voluntary markets offer great potential, their regulation and credibility are factors that are key in determining their success. So what is becoming more clear is that carbon pricing isn't just about adding a financial cost to emissions. It's about changing behaviors, driving innovation, and steering both public and private sectors towards sustainable practices. As Aditi highlighted, the various mechanisms like carbon taxes and cap and trade systems offer different paths, each with its unique strengths and challenges. Shaurya's insights into how businesses respond to these changes showed us how sustainability can go hand in hand with profitability. And as Devyansh rightly mentioned as well, voluntary carbon markets are paving the way for new forms of climate action, though they still require rigorous oversight to truly make a difference. As we look ahead, I like to pass on things over to Prabhu, who will take us through some of the remaining key questions on the implementational challenges of carbon pricing. Over to you, Prabhu.
Thank you so much, Tanishi. First of all, I would like to thank all of my co-panelists for the wonderful insights that they've given us. Um, for the second part of this discussion, as we know that any policy or business decision before it is implemented, it is very important that we also look into the equity and the how just the transition will be. So I would like to talk about two important things here. So first of all, when companies are required to purchase more carbon credits to offset their emissions, especially in carbon stringent industries, it is somewhat obvious that they will pass on these costs directly onto the consumer, which might not be so favorable for communities with lower incomes, which could sort of create um, an unjust mechanism where they're not able to efficiently pay for services. And secondly, in the recent years, a lot of companies and investors have also started making huge land based investments, particularly in forested areas in developing countries. And this has also often led to the practice of green grabbing, where for the purpose of acquiring this land, because the carbon that is fixed by this land is then used as carbon credits or carbon emission offsetting carbon emissions. This has also led to a lot of communities who originally stay in that land to be misplaced, and this is what we call green grabbing. So this is these are a few of the challenges of implementing carbon credit systems and carbon pricing mechanisms that are just put out there. But I would also like to call upon Meghna to familiarize us a little more with some of the challenges. So Meghna, I'd like to pass it on to you over here.
Yeah, I hope I'm audible. So the thing is, carbon pricing, it's quite a new idea, so it does have a lot of issues within it. So I want to highlight three issues, the third one being something I consider major. So, like, unfortunately, there are many challenges in implementing carbon pricing system because these prices must be large enough to stimulate a significant decarbonization. Because, if the cap is too lenient, it will not reduce emissions. The issue with this is that it can negatively impact businesses. So I want to talk about particularly the EU's CBAM, which is Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which comes under EU's, emission trading system ETS. So with EU CBAM, they introduced something called free allowances. If so, basically, if there is a company that is required to pay carbon prices, there is a chance that they might shift the production to jurisdictions that are outside the EU, so which do not have carbon pricings, or have laxer ones. But if there are no free allowances, the thing is, there is a chance of carbon leakage. So countries which are producing these carbons, the carbon production of that particular company might shift to a different company. Another major thing is that it has a high chance of disrupting trade because carbon markets by themselves are very volatile, leading to uncertainty in long term investments. So I found a study, a 2024 study by Asian Development Bank, that finds that CBAM is anticipated to significantly disrupt global trade and results in a 1.1% reduction in Asian exports to the EU. Although this sounds like something that's not that major, 1.1% trade is actually reduction of trade is actually quite a significant amount. And coming to the third one, as Prabhup herself mentioned, equity. I believe this is a major concern that should exist, which is about equity, because there can be a disproportionate impact on low income communities because they might face, higher energy costs. So the CBAM aims to ensure that European companies are required to pay for their carbon dioxide emissions and compete on equal terms with non-EU companies importing their products to the EU. So basically, what it does is, so if a company in the EU is paying a certain amount of tax for their carbon emissions, then companies that are not from EU are also supposed to pay that particular amount of tax so that they can export their goods into the EU. So the thing is, the CBAM does not provide for the recycling of the revenue. So these companies from the non-EU countries, once they pay tax, the tax lies with the EU itself and does not recycle back to the exporting companies. So I believe that this perpetuates, further inequality, because let's say even if a third country has a carbon pricing regime and it is considered effective, they may still have to bear the tax burden, as they would still be taxed for the remaining tax amount that they didn't pay. So like I believe that it is essential, especially to challenge this imposition of high carbon tax. Again, this comes as a paradox for not having stringent taxes that over the carbon pricing, because not having means it would be very difficult to enforce that, but having it also has its negative drawbacks, right? So like countries that have high export dependence on the most carbon intensive production chains, they're especially hit hardest. So there is this research I found by Ms. Sunita Narayan. So their team actually compared it, and they found that a CBAM imposition of CBAM on India would be equivalent to 0.05% of India's GDP, the tax burden on India by itself. So basically, this is why I personally think what they should do is that they should the taxes that are imposed primarily must be recycled back in a way to the exporting countries. So this doesn't particularly hinder the development of the country, while uh, allowing the countries to do tax carbon trade. Because personally I think this is especially the CBAM, I think it's more on the lines of as a balancing the playing field rather than actually taxing the environment. So I believe personally steps should be taken to actually control focus on the environmental aspect rather than trade, so that it would be a more effective system. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Meghna. I'm glad you could make it to this discussion despite of your health issues. I really appreciate you for that. And also, it was very interesting how you gave us an an understanding of how this would have implications for India. So yeah, I think a really good insight that we got from you. As we come to the end of this roundtable, in conclusion, I would like to say that carbon pricing is a crucial strategy in the fight against climate change, driving businesses and individuals towards sustainable practices. And each mechanism, whether it's carbon taxes, cap and trade, or voluntary markets, has its own benefits and implementation challenges. Also, addressing equity concerns is essential to ensure low income communities are not disproportionately proportionately affected, and innovative solutions can help achieve this. And last but not the least, by learning from successful implementations worldwide, we can refine our approaches and create a balanced framework that promotes both economic growth as well as environmental responsibility. So, before we end the discussion, I would like any one of our our panelists to step up and give us any concluding remarks that they might have. Yes, Devyansh, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So I'd just like to end with saying that I think it's very crucial that in between our pursuit of ensuring functioning carbon markets, I think it's very important that we ensure that our primary goal, which is real and measurable climate impact and health, isn't overshadowed by financial incentives. We've spoken about problems such as greenwashing, double counting, etc., and all of these things must be carefully managed. And I also think that there's a very strong need for regulatory oversight, because today we've spoken about how there's multiple different standards and institutions doing their own sort of thing when it comes to regulating carbon markets. And since there's also clashes between compliance and voluntary markets, it leads to an overall reduction in the actual social welfare that we're putting out. And lastly, I also think that the idea of carbon markets can perhaps be taken a step forward, where companies could maybe explore the idea of donating to specific local ecosystems, so that the average citizen can tangibly see how carbon markets are benefiting the environment. And then I believe this will generate more and more traction, which will fasten the goal of achieving sustainable businesses and ultimately reducing emissions.
I think all of your points were absolutely wonderful, very spot on. Just to elucidate a little bit on how one can make sure, just elaborate a little bit on Meghna's point as well, just to how we can make carbon pricing more effective. One of the strategies I could think of was to make sure to make sure gradual implementation of these strategies. So where carbon pricing is introduced slowly, giving households and businesses time to adapt. So coupled with government policies that support transition into clean energy, such as subsidies for solar panels or electric vehicle incentives. So this approach can really help ensure that lower income households are not left behind. So yeah, that's it.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Tanishi. I think that is much needed um, if we want to implement carbon pricing at such a high level, even in developing countries, as well as countries that have a large number of people living, not living in preferable economic conditions. So yeah, I think with that, we come to the end of this roundtable. I would like to thank all of you once again to take out time to contribute to today's roundtable, and I hope we all gained a lot of insights from each other's perspective. So yeah, thank you so much, everyone.
Prabhu?